Alienware Command Center is used to administer and manage the different performance modes for this laptop, and there are quite a few here. If we look at the actual application, we've got 6 different modes starting with battery, quiet, balanced, performance, and finally overdrive. And if you look at the descriptions of these settings, I really believe they could be reduced to just down to 3. Now it is confusing between performance and overdrive, but the performance and overdrive modes are quite similar. Overdrive was used for most benchmarking that I have done on this particular laptop. In the custom profile, you are very limited in terms of selections, and I've gone into the BIOS and checked this, see if you can set PBO to manual mode. However, it does not seem to make a difference here with giving us the ability to undervolt, nor is there any overclocking of the GPU manually. So that said, there also isn't really any fan controls here in this application. I don't know if this is due to being an AMD system, or if this is just the way that Alienware is now doing it with their Alienware Command Center, but this is a little bit of a letdown for such a high-end gaming laptop where there's such a high-end GPU. The next thing to look at is the AMD Adrenalin software in the gaming tab. From the home tab, if you navigate over to gaming, you'll find there a graphics tab, and this is where AMD has hidden an additional layer of performance profiles that are very specific to the AMD GPUs and the Radeon drivers. You've got default, power saving, quality, and Hyper RX. These 4 modes can be applied both to the iGPUs as well as the discrete GPUs, in this case the RX 7900M, and toggling each of these presets will basically select a plethora of configuration options that help optimize your gaming for either quality, which means visual fidelity, or things like Hyper RX, which basically tune your games whether they are supporting FSR or not, with upscaling tech at the driver level to allow you to gain some additional frames per second while you play. So this video will look at all 3 different modes here. And if we look at the AMD Adrenalin software, we also have under the performance tab, there is also a tuning tab, or I guess sub-tab. Within tuning, you'll find here the AMD Smart Shift. This is the way that AMD manages the power distribution between the CPU and the GPU. And by default, this is automatic. You cannot really adjust it. However, luckily, AMD has provided us a game profile option where you can select a game that you've been playing and optimize your power distribution on your CPU versus GPU per game. Keep in mind, it is still buggy, and sometimes when you open up the profile, it doesn't actually open, which means you'll just have to play a little bit of tag here between the different tabs, toggle in, back, forth, and come back into the tab where you'll be able to, again, resume configuring your game profile. So this video will also look at the different game profiles, interacting with the performance mode and the overdrive mode, the highest modes for Alienware Command Center, to see what kind of performance we can get out of those modes in a few games here, a few select games. Now that said, we'll be looking at the tuning profile. If you select here the Cyberpunk tuning profile that we've just added, keep in mind by default the power shift is handled by the CPU and GPU and smarts automatically. However, there is a manual override which allows you to toggle towards the GPU. In my testing, this seemed to have had little effect as the CPU was still heavily the one that was power shifted towards. Now, if we jump into benchmarks here, let's quickly look at Assassin's Creed Mirage. We've got here with overdrive mode, adaptive quality to off, and no FSR. So this is basically native rasterization performance with TAA. We've got at a 1200p, preset, we're looking at about 100 frames per second, more or less, regardless of what profile or performance mode you choose. If you choose Hyper RX, your 1% lows and your minimums do take a dip. In this slide here, we look at whether or not we have FSR2 enabled with or along with FSR2 and Hyper RX. AMD particularly hasn't provided currently any information whether you should be able to combine the two, Hyper RX being running at the driver level with FSR, whereas FSR2 is a higher iteration of FSR which is supported by games and has to be supported by the game. In this case here, we see that our frame rates remain pretty much untouched between the different modes, overdrive or performance. And as we bleed here into the Hyper RX versus the FSR2 performance, I've tested here with FSR2, off or on, and we see here that there's very little change here, except for perhaps the minimums and the 1% lows. They do get a little bit of a boost when you're running with FSR2, and that's to be expected since it's running a newer version of the algorithm. for upscaling tech. So if you're looking to get better upscaling resolution, be sure to play the game that has FSR2 or perhaps even FSR3 enabled rather than relying on HyperRX. Now, that said, if we move right along in the performance mode, we'll see here the numbers remain very, very similar to what we saw with the overdrive mode. So as far as the Alienware Command Center is concerned and the M18R1 with that 7900M, you'll be pushing very, very similar frame rates in the two modes. If you do drop down, however, to balance, there is a pretty noticeable drop in performance. So if you're looking for gaming chops, play in the performance mode. And if we continue on here to look at the performance mode versus the overdrive mode difference, as I've just said, with a few exceptions and outliers here, everything seems to be pretty much in check and within a margin error of range in many cases here. You'll be getting very, very similar performance, except with performance mode, you will have a little bit more pleasure in your ears with a little bit less fan noise. So it's better to trade off that with, of course, the exchange being that higher thermals. If we switch over to Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, here this was tested again at the 1200p resolution with Ultra preset, the RT Ultra preset, sorry, with FSR2 quality enabled. This is in the overdrive mode. We're looking at the three different graphics settings that are offered in the AMD Adrenalin software, HyperRX, quality, and default. We see here that we get very, very similar performance again, with the only noticeable changes being either in the 1% lows or in the minimum frame rates on these different settings. If we move right along, looking at the FSR2 quality settings in overdrive mode, and the three different profile presets, we've got very similar performance here, 60 frames per second average roughly, and with our 1% lows sitting at around the high 20s to perhaps very, very low 30s, with the exception there if you're looking at the quality mode, because obviously it's going to focus on visual fidelity, so you do get a lower minimum and 1% lows than you would in the other two modes. And if we move right along here, this is the, again, performance comparison between HyperRX versus FSR2 being enabled. Can you combine those two? Well, it looks like here that in some cases you can get better frame rates with HyperRX plus FSR2, as is shown by the blue bar here, 60 frames per second versus just 37.5 with the FSR2 being off. So maybe there is some truth to this. However, I haven't been able to confirm this, with more than one instance of that appearing. As we move along here in performance mode, again, we're seeing very similar frame rates here, but you can see that we're getting 1% lows that are starting to dip when we switch over to HyperRX performance. I know that there was a lot of hype about AMD saying one button push and you'll be able to game right away. Fantastic, but then why are we seeing these lower frame rates and how can they be explained? I currently don't have a solution other than the fact that it's using a lower version of FSR than FSR2 is that's natively supported by the game. And if we look at the comparison between the performance mode and the overdrive mode from the Alienware Command Center, toggling between the two different performance modes on this laptop will net you roughly the same level of performance, with the exception there's a few outliers here. But again, those are either due to HyperRX, which I said does boost the minimums and the 1% lows in certain cases, but it can also drop your overall average frame rates. So it's a little bit of a hit and miss situation there. And just for comparison, I've taken a look at Hogwarts Legacy as well. We're looking at the difference here in the overdrive mode. No ray tracing, no frame generation, as we don't have that available yet on mobile laptop GPUs from AMD. It's called AMD Fluid Motion frames, so hope to see that soon. But we're seeing here that we're getting excellent performance, 98 frames per second with HyperRX and FSR2 off. So this then flips the tables on what we just saw with the HyperX performance dropping in games like Cyberpunk 2077. And moving right along to Red Dead Redemption 2, this was tested with ultra settings, favor quality mode, everything cranked to ultra, and with the Vulkan API, we can see here that we're getting TAA versus the FSR2 quality. So this is showing us that upscaling does work, and we've got 127 frames per second with FSR2 enabled versus 18.6, which isn't bad for the 118.6, which isn't bad from the native rendering. It's one thing to see charts, but it's another thing to see the actual benchmarks and the performance figures. If we look here, this game, the Assassin's Creed Mirage, the latest entry in the series, is showing a lot of stutter on that frame time graph, and those stutters are actually visible as micro stutters within the game itself. So it looks to me like there's still some AMD optimization for drivers, particularly that this used to be an AMD sponsored game, and now it's swapped over to an Intel ZSS sponsored game. So alliances have changed hands here, and as a result, we're seeing some stuttering effects in this particular game. And if you look at the frame time graph that's generated from within the game, this is very evident of that. And I think that's the story here with the RX 7900M, is there's still some definitely tweaking required. Given AMD, we're looking at about 6 months to a year before this CPU or GPU becomes flawless for gaming. And keep in mind that you don't really have ray tracing chops here. That said, though, we are able to run R3 Ultra preset on Cyberpunk 2077 here and got roughly close to 60 FPS and be able to enjoy that experience. And we're seeing about 150 to 160 watts roughly on that GPU, nowhere near that 200 watts that were promised. But of course, keep in mind this is running on the internal 480 hertz full HD display. Another downside for this particular GPU should be looking at 1440p or up if you're looking to actually make the most of the 7900M and the 16 gigabytes of VRAM that it includes. It is able to hit 200 watts, and I've demonstrated that in another live video that I've done. So, there's nothing really to rant about there. Also, if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and ring that notification bell so you get updates when I release new videos or when I go live with some commentary, some reviews, first looks, and also game streams as well. So please get subscribed to the channel. It really helps make this possible. And also, if we look here at Red Dead Redemption 2, RDR2, this is the type of frame time graph we should be looking at. Look at that. It's a solid between 7, 8, 9 milliseconds roughly, and we're seeing it as a literal flat line. That means the frames are being generated as quickly as they're being pushed to the display without any lag whatsoever. And this is being run without any HyperX or anything. This is on the default mode. With the HyperX involved or even FSR2 involved, there's still some tweaks that are definitely needed there, as we'll show here in Starfield rather, and we'll conclude this video with that. So thanks everybody for watching, and look at the frame time graphs and those bumps. Man, this is a micro stuttering mess with FSR2 or with the Radeon Super Resolution in the Hyper RX performance mode or quality mode in the drivers. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.